I'm going to pass over to Ken to introduce the speaker, because he's been arranging the speaker for us, for which we're very pleased.
Well, a couple of years ago, I realised that we had among us a number of members, not just NUF members in the denomination as a whole, who termed themselves humanists or religious humanists. And I read an article in the Inquirer which used the term humanist spirituality, and I thought, well, I'm not sure. Is there such a thing? Is it a contradiction in terms? I ought to find out. So I went to the fount of all wisdom these days, Amazon, and looked for a book. And I typed in humanist spirituality, and the first book at the top of the list was this little book, Walking Without God by Ben Whitney. And I read the review, which was most effusive, and then I found, to my surprise, that it was written by Ben's daughter. And I thought, well, if his daughter approves his work, this is somebody we ought to hear from. And I read the book, and I thought, yes, this is somebody we ought to hear from. You've, in your welcome packs, had an account of Ben's life history and where he's been and how he's come to his present position. And I think we're all looking forward immensely to hearing what he has to say. And he's taken his title, The Fool on the Hill. A Humanist Looks at the Crucifixion. Ben.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. It really is a great pleasure. Life, as they say, is a journey. My journey has taken me in many strange directions, from social worker to Baptist minister to lay reader in the Church of England, back to social worker again, to really professing no Christian faith at all, or worshipping in any church community, to early retirement, to running my own training and consultancy business that works with schools, and a bit of time to reflect on theology and belief and practice and spirituality and all of that again, which is really what I've been doing in the last 2 or 3 years. It really is very good to make links with you again. I've been talking over lunch. I did my Baptist ministerial training at the Northern Baptist College, now part of Luther King House, and in those days the Unitarian College was a great edifice of a building, I seem to recall, where we shared some of our training with students from the Unitarian College, now part of that federation at Luther King House. So I feel I have some links with your denomination in the past, and it's very good to make some links with you again. Unlike my usual work of training events, I decided not to go for a PowerPoint today, but to offer you a more formal address for half an hour or so and then take questions. I hope that's okay. I'm told that nobody these days can listen for more than 5 minutes without some kind of visual stimulation, perhaps especially straight after lunch. Maybe it's less than 5 minutes this time of the day, but let's see if we can prove them wrong. I wonder, how does Radio 4 survive without any pictures? One of the most interesting books that I've read in recent years is Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I don't know whether you've come across it. It's a book that charts the somewhat erratic progress of our species across millennia. It's a rich mixture of anthropology and sociology and history and philosophy, which explores who we are as a human race and what we've always been. What is it that makes us human? How do we get to here, and what does our future hold? It's a wonderfully written and a fascinating read. It's a terrific book. Now, he writes particularly about what he calls the fictions and the myths which we have created as a species in order to organise our life together and maintain some kind of order. And religion, as you would expect, crops up frequently in that story. Believing in something or in someone is an almost universal characteristic of any society, at least until relatively recently. But it's also evident in the story that those beliefs grow out of the contexts in which they occur. So, for example, the ancient Egyptians had myths about the Nile and their crops and the sun and so on. They didn't worship David Beckham. who does, we ask, yes. And while there are often very many similarities, as humans are much the same the world over, those contexts also produce very specific belief systems that reflect their individual cultures and needs. And this sometimes bewildering variety does not, at least to me, testify to any one reality behind it all or to the ultimate truth of any one religion, in fact, perhaps quite the reverse. But it does demonstrate the enormous creativity of the human race and the human communities that devise those beliefs. Now, it's sad to me that so many belief systems seem to stifle that quest for originality rather than stimulate it, and to substitute mere conformity in its place. At their best, I'm not sure that's ever what religions were for, but that is so often what they have become. Now, Christianity is no exception, I think, but there may yet be some truths that we can salvage from the wreckage. People like Auguste Comte or Ludwig Feuerbach or Alain de Botton in more modern times have helped us to see that the various religions we've created have been an essential part of our human struggle to understand ourselves. Even if you do take the view that a particular faith puts you in touch with a supernatural reality beyond, you can't also deny that the way in which any religion has come to where it is by men and women drawing on what they know of life here and now and giving it a deeper significance. So in that sense, I would want to say that it is us who have created our gods, not the other way around. Spirituality is a tool for understanding our humanity, not an alternative intruder that helps us to avoid it. Now, this may well be what some of you already think. We'll see. I might even be a closet Unitarian, I'm not quite sure. But I call my own very modest take on this, as Ken has said, humanist spirituality, because I want to be in that difficult place between faith and humanism. Neither one nor the other seems to me to give us all that we need. Now, it's not, of course, an original idea at all, though I didn't realise how many other people have been exploring related ideas until I started looking for them. But my basic starting point is that every element of a religious life, creeds, doctrines, temples, scriptures, values, and all the rest, have their origins in human activity. They're not a revelation from beyond, but a realization from within. Nobody really believes, for example, that the Bible fell from heaven already written in the authorized version. Well, actually, maybe a few people do. But we know that they are wrong. We can chart the history of the Christian religion, or indeed of any other. They're not givens over which we have had no influence. It is so obviously a very human story. So to reflect for a moment on some elements of traditional religious life. Scriptures have not always existed. They were created, retold, written down, edited, revised at identifiable points in time. Creeds were debated and agreed and rewritten and abandoned according to prevailing views in the councils at that time. Councils which, seems to me, were a bit like an EU summit in which some kind of compromise often won the day in the final communique, or some other vested interest was deliberately outlawed. Even prayer is a human activity. It's spoken with our lips or thought by our brains. Moral values arise from our experience of what is best for us, living together in community and individually. It's a fundamental mistake to see those things as coming from outside of ourselves, They are ours, and we should be proud of them. Even our concept of a God, if you still have one, is the product of human activity. There can be no supernatural experience for us because we function within a natural world. Nothing can be done or known or experienced without reference to our physical selves in times and places. A religious experience is a human experience under another name. But putting any religion in its place as an entirely human creation doesn't necessarily mean that I want to abandon its insights altogether. Knowing what it is doesn't necessarily rob it of any value. Because the human questions behind the creed still matter. If you regard your belief systems as given to you from somewhere else, then perhaps you're making rather less of them and of yourself than you should. But that also means that there can be no lines in the sand beyond which we cannot go because the boundaries have been set down for us. We created them, we can change them. Indeed, we must do so. Religions have often got things wrong. We can and we must do better in the light of what we now know. Now, this makes genuine dialogue very difficult with those who do believe that they've encountered some deeper, unchanging deity. But given that I still have at least one foot in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I don't really have a choice but to still engage with it. I'm not the first to walk along this path, even if the map I'm using is a bit more up to date than some of those from long ago. But there's a crucial difference between the idea of a humanist spirituality and a conventional religious faith. Faith is about signing up to what someone else has already discovered. If you go on an alpha course, which I wouldn't personally recommend, not even for the free meal, you're invited to come and hear the truth as they see it, not to engage in a debate. The publicity outside the church always suggests that I'm the one who has the problem. It says I can come with my questions and I'll find answers there about the meaning of life. But that's something of a deceit, because only certain questions, and therefore certain answers, are on the agenda. A conventional idea of a God is a given, and you can't get past week one without him. It's a bit like Michael Gove's understanding of education. The transfer of information from the teacher's notes to the student's notes, but without entering the mind of either. The end result is that you now know what others have told you to be true, that you didn't know before, and you can pass the exam at the end. The outcome is determined in advance. It's not a genuine journey of discovery at all. It's based on certain assumptions about the destination that you have to make before you can begin the journey. And that kind of process has nothing to do with what I mean when I talk about using the full range of our humanity to find a spirituality. So in light of all that by way of preamble, I want to use this time with you to explore some ideas that also crop up in my book, The Apostate's Creed. Nice witty title. That's free for you to download from my website. And if you've already had a look at it, forgive me for repeating myself, but I'll be fascinated to hear of any comments you have later. But my appetite and my budget for publishing books myself is now exhausted, though I do have copies of my latest book here today, Updating the Map, about a new way of looking at the Bible. Now, I don't want to take any of these home with me, so although they have a price of recommended £5, you can take one for free if you wish, or leave whatever you want to, and the cash will not come to me, it will go to the Unitarians from this occasion. And so by the end of the 2 days, I hope there'll be no left and people will have taken one. Please read it if you take one, that's all I ask. And better still, read it and send me some comments. My email address on my website is in the book. The previous books are still on sale at Amazon in aid of my local hospice if you want to look at them. But rather like modern musicians, I'm at the stage now where I'd rather give them away and at least have people read them. Now, the book on the website, the download book, The Apostate's Creed, is of course based on the Apostles' Creed. My first task in looking at that context was to understand what the compilers of the creeds thought they were doing at the time, without hopefully entering into too much arcane discussion about debates of obscure sounding distinctions which are now entirely lost on us. But we do first have to examine the original text. I've just spent a really happy few weeks engaging in a Shakespeare class for the first time in 45 years. It's been terrific fun to go back to a discussion group looking at the works of Shakespeare, thinking about the text and reading it together and reflecting on what it's all about. We've really been doing exactly the same with that Shakespeare text as we should with the Bible or with any religious text. What my old theology tutors used to say, exegesis before hermeneutics. First of all, think about the context, understand where the document is coming from, understand its background, and then talk about how it might relate to the current time that we live in. So that's what I try to do with the Apostles' Creed. But I want to take the statements of the Creed on into whether they can still mean anything to people like me who are in search of a new kind of spirituality. And I'm going to focus on just one of them to reflect on with you for the next few minutes. Of course, these ancient insights deserve to be studied and understood, but their conclusions, given my thesis about where religion comes from, are not fixed for all eternity. We now have to express ourselves differently because of what we've discovered since, and then we might find new kinds of truths in which to put our trust. So given Wednesday's upcoming date and the Easter season, I'm returning to the chapter I called The Fool on the Hill. And here I discuss what I'm to make of the death of Jesus of Nazareth, quotes, suffered under Pontius Pilate, crucified, died, and was buried. Now the Jesus story starts, of course, with Christmas. I spent it this year in New York, just 2 days after the random murder of 2 police officers, which was dominating the local news. Around the same time, while we were there on holiday, there was a dreadful atrocity in Pakistan, a killing of a lot of children in a school. There was the murder of an entire family in Australia. There was a mass shooting elsewhere in the USA that same week. There always seems to be some such event around that time of the year. But in the download book, I write particularly about Christmas 2012. At that time, the news was dominated by one story: the shooting dead of 20 children and 6 adults at a school in Connecticut by a deranged young man with an assortment of high-powered weapons that he'd taken from his mother, who was the first victim of his spree. Now, some religious people, given the timing, would have drawn a connection with the slaughter of the innocents that, according to Matthew at least, followed the birth of Jesus. That would be understandable, even though actually there's very little factual basis for such an event ever having happened. It's probably more likely to be a symbolic event trying to demonstrate the significance of the birth of Jesus as his later followers saw it. Just as Pharaoh had reacted to God's activity on behalf of his chosen with the killing of the firstborn, so did Herod. That was the logic behind that story, I'm sure. But what are we to make of tragic events like that? The news this week has been dominated by yet more tragedy. I don't know what to feel anymore about the sadness of the plane that was brought down in the Alps. How awful for the families caught up in that experience. How awful for the family of the pilot. How awful for those who've found that that whole time of their lives has been destroyed by a tragedy that no one could possibly have predicted. Now, how does a contemporary spirituality, humanist or non-humanist, cope with a question that's raised by the tragedies of these kinds of events? Many believers of the more traditional kind may well ask, if not always out loud, how their God could allow such a thing to happen. Some will blame a devil, but of course neither of those solutions will work for me. Human beings are entirely responsible for such behaviour. whether it's the lack of gun control or the result of fragmented families or the abuse of power or bigotry or whatever it is that causes people to lose all sense of reason and become madmen. There is no God, there is no devil who we can hold to account for such inhumanity. It's just part of the package, like love and sunshine and Chopin. Now, schools rather than churches are my world these days, and it's just been the anniversary of the day in 1996 when Thomas Hamilton walked into the primary school in Dunblane and killed 16 children and their teacher. There was a similar event in Wolverhampton, where I now live, about the same time. And there too, the bravery of a young teacher saved more children from being injured and almost certain death. Terrible things like these happen every day. Like everyone else, I can only read and make myself aware of some of them. Now, without doubt, at least one of the teachers in the Connecticut outrage deliberately surrendered her own life in order to save some of her pupils. She locked a group of small children in a storeroom, then she went back towards the noise of the gunfire to try and save some more. She put herself between the gunman and a group of 6-year-olds who were cowering in a corner, and she died protecting them. Now, I'm staggered and challenged by a sacrifice of that kind. I'm sure I could never hope to do anything like the same. Now, I've no idea whether she was a Christian, quite possibly she was, but of course it doesn't matter one bit, does it? Now, for me, the death of Jesus of Nazareth is a universal paradigm of such self-sacrifice, a demonstration of love for others that makes the actions of those teachers a genuinely sacramental and fully human moment. The deeper spiritual truth that comes from such deaths and gives them meaning is that somehow, out of that disaster, there is hope. Not in supernatural terms, not because some magic rabbit is going to be pulled out of a hat, but in human terms, some deeper truth about our humanity. You remember when Lee Rigby was killed outside Woolwich Barracks? One of the photographs in the paper the next morning was of 3 women kneeling at his body, caring for his wounds. Where have you heard a story like that before? That sign of human compassion in the face of such cruelty gives me more hope for humanity and for my own life than 1 million evangelical tracts about my so-called salvation ever will. Now, many might consider such actions foolish and pointless. But as even St. Paul suggests, there's surely evidence of a much greater wisdom about the way things are. Part of the lingering attraction of Christianity is the unjust human death that is at the heart of it, and the response that it evokes in us as human beings. It's just the alleged supernatural explanation that I can't affirm. Surely the key point about the figure at the centre of this particular death is that he was the victim of our inhumanity. Now, this is where I do start to share some of the language of conventional believers. We suffer, but we also destroy. The meaning to be found here is not about our need to be saved from our collective sin, however. It's about our collective solidarity. This event earths all meaningful spirituality in the reality of the human condition, which so often confronts us with tragedy and with injustice and with our own shortcomings. Now, the cross is such an enduring symbol in Christianity that there can be no doubt this really was how Jesus of Nazareth died. There would have been no reason to invent such a thing. It would have been such an embarrassment. It could have been easily disproved, surely, if it didn't actually happen, if he died in his sleep as an old man, as some of the more fanciful fiction would have us believe. Most religions go in for myths that build up their central figures. They don't portray them as a condemned and broken man dying on a rubbish dump. That's the great central power of the Christian story. Jesus' death fits with what else I know to be true about life. Good people die, often unjustly. Much suffering is caused by our inhumanity, that's a fact. Somehow, this event still has the power to make other deaths of the same kind more significant and worth something. So why is that? What is it about the death of Jesus that still has some significance, even for someone like me who doesn't believe in a God? It will no doubt reassure you to hear me say that I don't see how this real Jesus can have anything to do with the second person of an eternal Trinity. I'm not sure he has much to do with the subsequent Christ of the Church either. But where did such ideas about him come from? Remember, religions and beliefs grow out of our human experience. They're not imposed upon them from outside. So this later Christ figure is itself the creation of a community who were up against it and who needed a reassurance of their own survival. As they too faced the reality of persecution, it seems that the need for a saviour who would rescue and reward the faithful took over from the memory of the fool on the hill who talked about a new kind of kingdom, not of a church, and who lived and died a Jew, not the founder of something called Christianity. The Roman historian Tacitus writes about how the bodies of this pernicious sect were hung on crosses and set alight to provide flaming torches in Rome during the reign of Nero, about 30 years after the death of Jesus. They were no doubt unfairly blamed for the fires that almost destroyed the city, so he devised a particularly cruel punishment in response. In that short time, it seems that the reality of their own suffering came to dominate their memory of Jesus and changed the explanation for his death. What does the Creed say? Why did Jesus die? Because he was crucified by Pontius Pilate. But suddenly now it was all about their God, being there with them, putting things right, as it were, dying for them. And all this, of course, before a single word of the Gospels was written. Somehow this wider meaning went on to dominate what they wrote about later. Building on a new understanding of the Old Testament text, a whole new theology around his death was constructed. That seems to be what has happened. And it's from that that we get all this emphasis on Jesus being a sacrifice for sin, a direct result of the human events that happened after his death, not the driver that caused them. New Testament Christianity took the old prophecies and transformed them into something else, because that's what religions do. And the context was very different, wasn't it? Once the gospel moved into the Greek-speaking world, the old idea of the Messiah as the liberator of the Jewish people no longer meant anything. So something new came in its place. But as the creeds actually make explicit, but then ignore, Jesus died not because of any supernatural pulling of strings, but because he upset the Jewish establishment who persuaded a weak Roman governor to have him killed. That is the reason for his death. It happens all the time. So if I'm to reflect on whether or not the crucifixion still has any significance, I have to acknowledge that I'm utterly unconvinced by any claim that Jesus' death was actually some deliberate prearranged contract in which a God exchanged his son, whatever that means, for the innate guilt of the rest of us. That would mean that the whole human story that led to it was entirely incidental, just a cover story for God's higher purposes. And there are so many levels at which, quite frankly, that's so unbelievable. I just don't see how that helps us. The killings go on. The world does not become a better place as a result of this divine act. Of course, many Christians of the more conventional kind would also affirm that the only hope in this situation lies in its uniqueness. This was a once-for-all event. I heard someone say something like that in a church yesterday morning. This was a once-for-all event that's changed the relationship between us and God forever. The death of Jesus is entirely different from all other deaths, because Jesus is different from all other human beings. In contrast, a humanist spirituality would say that the only hope is in the fact that he's the same. That Jesus and me and the children of Dunblane and the Connecticut teachers and the victims of 9/11 and of Flight 4U9525 and those killed by the Taliban and Boko Haram and ISIS and all the rest in the great litany of human suffering, the only hope is that we all share a common humanity. And indeed we share it even with the killers. The hope comes in the light that such an event spreads into my life, not that it is uniquely different from it. Despite the tragedy of such deaths, the world is not actually a universally awful place. Human experience tells us that there is a great deal of good to be found within it. It's not that the alleged one-off resurrection of a Jesus breaks all the normal rules. It's that our common humanity shows us all the time that there is life to be found out of death. It's part of who we are. So we shouldn't be asking people to believe impossible things against the odds, but to open their eyes to what's actually going on around us. I think Jesus of Nazareth would have called this seeing the signs of the kingdom. But I wonder if we're actually talking about the same thing. The executions are balanced by the human self-sacrifices, the selfishness by the generosity, the aggression and oppression of some balanced by the willingness of others to put others first. It may just be possible to believe that something else was going on as well, but not instead of the historical reality. The question for me now is, which alleged meaning to this death still speaks to us? Jesus as the victim of our inhumanity, but who also shows us that there is more to us, more hope to us than meets the eye? Or Jesus as the tool of a God who just used human beings for some greater purpose of his own? So much of the edifice of later religion just gets in the way, as far as I can see. So if you ask me straight out, as some of my evangelical friends occasionally have, does the death of Jesus make any difference? I think I can say yes. It makes a difference to my understanding of otherwise meaningless deaths. I will be in Lichfield Cathedral on Good Friday. Somehow the need to be part of that remembrance is still important. Somehow that experience of getting close to that death still makes some sense. And there is a truth here, even if it's not about changing my eternal status with a God who I don't believe is there. Might I even say that I still, in some sense, want to be at the foot of the cross, if only to recognise the significance of this death in order to give value and meaning to all the others. The first Christians came to their own conclusions about all this. I can't share them because I start from here and with what I understand to be true about the universe and its rational and scientific nature. I don't start from where they were. But by still telling the Jesus story, if without so many of the trimmings that have come later, I hope I'm still recognising the importance and the value of life. I don't accept any personal or collective guilt from which I need to be delivered. I do accept a collective and personal responsibility to seek the common good in the face of so much that undermines it. The death of Jesus still helps me to make some meaning out of my own life and of this world's gross injustices. There is still a connection between us that I find affirming and creative. I'm a long, long way from calling myself a Christian, but this much at least I believe. Thank you.
thank you for giving us such a good talk on Easter week. So often Unitarians miss out on a truly deep understanding of Easter week, and I think that was something very special.
Thank you.
So thank you. Any questions?
On here.
Well, thank you for an interesting talk. 2 questions. Do you believe that Jesus Christ actually lived and it's a true story? But isn't a major problem here with any religion or any political movement that after its founders have died, people manipulate it?
I mean, I think I would say that the evidence for the existence of somebody called Jesus who lived and died and was crucified around AD 30 is as good as it is for many other historical characters. Yes. And not all of that evidence comes from within the Christian tradition, though there are only limited sources outside of it. But I don't myself have a problem with the fact that such a person existed, and that although we always have the problem of trying to find out what the real Jesus was like, because we're also having to interpret later understandings and read back, as it were, from accounts which are clearly unbiased, not unbiased, I think there's enough historical reality for me to affirm the existence of the person. It seems to me inevitable that any human movement will make of what it does subsequently what suits its needs at the time. And I do believe that conventional Christian faith isn't necessarily going to get us close to the heart of what the intentions of that person was all about. And although that's very difficult to separate those 2 strands, we are perhaps more able to do that now than any generation before us, thanks to the growth of historical scholarship and literary criticism and all of that, which sadly so many believers don't want to know about. But my own view is that if you embrace that understanding, you get a better picture of the reality, not a worse one. But of course it is a picture which may well undermine many of the things which people have been told are true. So even within the story of the life of Jesus, I certainly wouldn't treat the birth narratives as having the same status as other elements of what Jesus may have been or stood for, because it seems to me they are far less likely to have historical reality. You have to make a judgment based on the nature of the sources. But I think that's an answer that, yes, I think I'm still going that far, but it is inevitably true that what came subsequently, would Jesus recognise the Christian church now as what he came to? I don't think so. In fact, I think I say in one of the books that he'd probably be more comfortable, he would see it more as evidence of the church that he came to sweep away. It looks very much like the Jewish church that he said he didn't want to be part of. And so I'm not sure that would be true. But I wouldn't expect anything else, because it's a human journey. It's a human story.
I'm not so sure it's a question, but a real thankful observation. This is very synchronistic, coming to hear you talk today. I'm a Unitarian minister, and like many ministers, always struggle with how to make Easter accessible to our congregations, many of who I think would see Jesus in the way that you've described. And we always sort of tend to muddle through and talk about spring and new life, and in some congregations, and avoid the story of Jesus. And so I always sort of try and make a point of focusing it on the story of Jesus. But this year, for the second year running, we're running a Good Friday service, which again isn't always the case in congregations. And synchronistically, this year, thinking of how do we make the story universal, we've decided pretty much to do what you just described, the idea of sacrifice universally. Stories, Jesus as the centre, a sacrifice of a man for the sake of his convictions, but also looking at all the other stories from different times and places of others who have been given their lives, as you were describing, in the news. And I'm just very struck by the synchronicity that we're at home planning to do that, and you've really sort of given me confirmation of a way of making the story accessible on the human level. So thank you. It's sort of great to come along and hear that, and to have that sort of confirmation that there is a point to the story. So thank you.
I think the word sacrifice is interesting, because in some ways the story of the Christian church demonstrates how the word sacrifice was taken over from its Old Testament roots to mean something that, you know, God did the sacrificing of Jesus, whereas I tend to think, well, I want to talk more about the way people sacrifice themselves, and that rings true with some of the sayings we have of Jesus himself, who talked about, you know, the need for self-giving and self-offering, and that's where the meaning comes from, rather than, you know, I just don't understand the concept of a God who kills his own son in order to put right the fact that I'm a sinner. I mean, I just can't see how that speaks to us of any significance. Whereas commending the model of sacrificial love in its own right, for its own sake, for its own worth, seems to me, you know, to still have some resonance. Yeah.
I'm Mark Stewart from Bristol. Doesn't the resurrection bit give hope to people who've lost their loved ones, especially if their loved ones died in a particularly horrific way, that the pain of that is going to be sort of healed and that they'll see them again after they've died? Isn't that an important part of the story?
The trouble is, I just don't believe it. It doesn't provide me with any hope or comfort because I just don't think it can possibly be true. My father died when I was 26. You know, my brother has died, my mother has died. I have no hope at all that relationship will ever be restored in some other way. That they lived, they died. I have no sense of hope for my own resurrection in that sense. I was born, I'll die. That to me is a reality which, hard though it is, and however comforting it is to suggest otherwise, I don't see any evidence for it. So for me, the experience of the resurrection of Jesus is something around a sense that he was still with them, a sense that his life had not been lived in vain. There's a sense in which Nelson Mandela is still with us. There's a sense in which good people's lives live on after them. But in terms of something in which I personally can put any faith, whilst it might be very comforting, I guess this is one reason why in the end I decided ministry in a conventional church was not for me. I couldn't say the words if I didn't really believe them. And I couldn't expect other people to find comfort in them if I didn't really have that conviction myself. And I just don't believe that will happen. I guess that's why I find I can't affirm it. But that's not to say there is no hope to be found in death or no hope to be found in suffering.
Thank you for your talk. I was quite surprised that Albert Schweitzer, in his book The Quest for Historical Jesus, went even further than you have suggested. And yet, when I was a lad, he was put out to be the great missionary, but actually he was a heretic. And he was a medical man. He wasn't allowed to be a theological missionary. And when you go through what academic theologians are discussing, a lot of what you say is well understood, I think. It's just that they can't say it to certain believers. So where does that leave you on spirituality, though?
Say a bit more.
Well, do you have a soul? Do you have a spirit? You describe yourself as spiritual.
Right.
A humanist spiritualist.
Spirituality to me is about an element of human life, not about an encounter with something beyond the human life. So when I use the word spirituality, I mean living life to the full, living life with an understanding of its meaning, a reflective approach to life, which is beyond simply getting up in the morning, having something to eat and going to work. You know, I that's what I mean by I don't believe in the existence of a soul, personally, no.
Thank you very much for your talk. Jesus as a man, well, that sounds very Unitarian. I was brought up as a Methodist, and I eventually became a Unitarian minister because of the way, initially at least, because of the way Unitarians have always seen Jesus as a man, which is what you're talking about, basically. You did say, correct me if I'm wrong, that faith is about signing up to what someone else has discovered. Now, that is not very Unitarian. I don't think our understanding of what faith is about signing up to what someone else has discovered. It's very much about our individual explorations, and life paths and what we can forge together as our own individual faith rather than taking it from someone else. So I wondered if you'd comment on that.
I mean, that may be the sense in which I'm saying I may be a closet Unitarian, because I have that understanding of what you mean by faith. I suppose what I'm saying is that if you go into any conventional Christian church or path, you won't get very far until you encounter some kind of creed. And whether that's an evangelical students' union or a Church of England, reciting of the creed or whatever, the understanding of what we mean by being here is defined by assent to certain statements of truth, and that's an expected step you have to take. I mean, if you're going to sign up at the end of the Alpha course, you have to sign up that you believe certain things. If you stand up in a Church of England church at any kind of worship, you'll be asked to recite the creed. Now, there are other spiritual paths, there are other understandings of faith, but in general terms, I would say faith is seen too much as, here is a list of propositions, do you agree? Rather than, here is a journey, where is it taking you?
Are you more of a materialistic humanist than a spiritual humanist?
Would you like to explore that a little bit more with me first?
Well,
what do you mean by the difference?
I don't know, I'm not a humanist.
I suspect, given the nature of human nature, I'm a combination of the two. I am undoubtedly materialistic because human beings are flesh and blood, and we are driven by animal passions and years of evolutionary history which make us focus very much on survival and achievement. But I hope I also have a dimension to me which is about something beyond that. So I'm not sure it's an either or. Can it be a both and?
I wanted to ask about the idea of enlightenment, and which you obviously find in the Buddhist religion, but also I think in mystical Christianity and the religions across the world. And that is an idea of, in fact, I was just reading an essay of Jung's about Zen, and he's talking about this idea of the Zen idea of enlightenment, of satori, of breaking through, and he quotes Christian mystic writers who use the same term. In other words, the idea that you break through or become enlightened or become born again, which I object to being hijacked by the evangelical movement. In other words, changed in a way that the small self or the ego self becomes subsumed in or has an encounter with something apparently bigger than itself or greater than itself. And if that enlightenment is sustained and realized, that way of being, as in the case of the Buddha, and I personally would believe in the case of Jesus, is sustained. And so that sense of small self becomes perhaps still there, but is small, and the sense of walking inside something bigger than oneself continues. And that seems to be something that arises in lots of different religions. And I'm wondering if, number one, you would accept such an idea. Is that just an evolutionary state of consciousness of human beings? Or is it something genuinely, as I suppose I'm tempted to believe, is that it's something from outside? I'm not sure what I mean by that, but you take my point.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very good question. One that one would want to think about a great deal more. I guess if I came from the Eastern tradition, I would probably be exploring that rather more. But because I come from a rationalist, scientific tradition, my focus is more on finding what it means to be fully human. I don't myself think that there is an external reality with which one can become more in tune in that objective sense. But I do think that the path of full humanity involves some ability to step outside and reflect on where one is going and what one is doing. But I'm not as skilled or as well versed in the Eastern tradition as I ought to be. My daughter, who wrote such a commendable review of my book, would call herself a Buddhist. So she's rather more in touch with some of those issues, I think, than I am. So I would hesitate to say more than that, really.
Isabel Peabody, Herefordshire. Going back to your question of sacrifice, what do you think that Jesus was trying to achieve by his sacrifice?
To put it at its bluntest, I don't think he had a choice. I don't think he necessarily did it, but I mean, if I'm seriously trying to get behind the story to the human reality, I don't believe he consciously chose the path of death. Personally, I don't think that's the case. I think he acted in what for him was an honourable human way, and just like millions of others, that honourable human way got up the noses of those who didn't like it, and they had him killed. I don't know that the people of Auschwitz chose sacrifice. They just lived human life, and other people took their lives from them. So I think the idea, I'm not sure Jesus thought that by dying here I'm going to make a difference. I'm not sure I can say that. I think I can say that whether that was in his mind or not, his dying can make some difference. But whether it was a God sacrificing him or him, in that sense, consciously sacrificing himself, I can't say. But I do know that when people behave in human ways, other people don't like that, and you know that was the consequence of his action. Could he have chosen a less human way which would have failed to offend the Jewish and Roman establishments? I don't know. So I'm not sure Jesus consciously sacrificed himself any more than God consciously sacrificed him. I do think he provides a model of human life which can often lead to other people feeling that they're threatened by that. And that's... Why did Jesus die? Crucified under Pontius Pilate.
I think it would be good if people had time to look at the books.
Don't look at them, take them away, please.
Take them away, but do come and have a look at the book.
Just to clarify, any funds you want to give are for the Unitarian Fellowship, for your funds. Because I'm grateful for the opportunity of being here with you today. So if you wish to make a donation, it won't be to me, it will be to the Unitarian Fellowship. But if you want to take one for nothing, I don't suppose anybody will notice.
We will at the NUF April notice. Thank you very, very much, Ben.
My pleasure.